This chapter is on the integumentary system. The word integumentary looks like the word integrity, and that's a good description for what it does in our body. It maintains the integrity of it, helps to protect the body, helps to cover the body. It acts as a natural built-in raincoat, which is really, really important. Remember that it's covered with the skin called the cutaneous membrane, which is our largest membrane, and the integumentary system is the largest uh, organ system as well. If you imagine taking the skin and laying it out flat, it's unbelievable the amount of surface area that would actually cover. So the integumentary system is, of course, the skin, but also its derivatives like the nail, which are hardened epithelial cells, hair, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands. So the two layers of the integument are the epidermis, which is the most superficial layer, which is what we see when we look at the skin. And as you learned in the previous chapter, it is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. And in this chapter, we'll be learning the names of those individual layers, which are in the epidermis. Deep to the epidermis is a layer called the dermis, which is made up of connective tissue. Two types of connective tissue, in fact. The superficial layer of the dermis is called the papillary layer. It's about 20% of the thickness of the dermis, and it's loose areolar connective tissue. Deep to the papillary layer is the reticular layer, a much stronger layer, primarily because it's made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Deep to the dermis is another layer yet called the subcutaneous layer, often abbreviated in medicine as sub-Q, because when the needle goes into the sub-Q layer, it's releasing it into primarily fat, which is adipose tissue. So it lies under the dermis, and it's composed of adipose primarily and some areolar connective tissue. So the layers of the epidermis are shown on this slide. So as you can see, the most superficial layer is the epidermis. It's divided into 4 or 5 layers, depending on where at in the body it is. Deep to the epidermis is the dermis, which contains the papillary layer and reticular layer. The papillary layer is named this way because it forms dermal papillae, which are actually all genetically determined. So there's a very specific epidermal ridge lying right on top of the dermal papilla, which is going to be responsible for our fingerprints. Deep to the dermis is then the subcutaneous layer, which is again mostly adipose connective tissue, but also some areolar connective tissue. Then there's a bunch of appendages or derivatives of the integument, as we call them, within primarily the dermis. And the skin is an organ because it has multiple tissues. It has epithelial tissue in the epidermis, connective tissue in the dermis, nerves, so it has nervous tissue, as well as the fourth type of tissue, which is muscle. And the muscle that we have is called the erector pili muscle, and it's called the goosebump muscle. When it contracts, our hair stands straight up. And when we follow the hair from the dermis and follow it out, the part that is actually sticking out is called the hair shaft. Then there are also some sweat glands, one of which is the merocrine sweat gland. This is the main type of sweat gland that we have. As you can see, it has a sweat gland duct and a sweat pore that are leaning out of it. So oftentimes the base of the sweat gland kind of looks like it's coiled up snakes, and then there is a pore that leads to the superficial layer of the integument. Another type of gland is the sebaceous oil gland, produces oil, and they kind of look like clusters of grapes, and they are associated with the hair follicle itself. So when we have oily hair, that is the culprit. So the base of the hair where it originally grows is at the hair follicle. Then there are some nerve fibers, one of which is tactile sensory receptors, which are activated by light touch. But there's also deeper ones, which are called Pacinian corpuscles, which are deeper in the reticular region of the dermis. So we see some sensory fibers, which are basically dendrites by themselves. So there's a lot of things in the integument that we're going to be exploring throughout this chapter. Functions of the integument include protection. So protection, for example, against trauma, toxic substances, solar radiation, protection from UV radiation, like the melanin that's produced from melanocytes. However, some chemicals can be absorbed. So this is why obviously things like acids, strong acids can be very damaging to the skin. So the skin has what we call selective permeability, only allows certain things to actually diffuse into the skin. The next function is that it prevents water loss and water gain because, again, it's kind of like I mentioned before, it is a natural raincoat. And one of the main reasons for this is that it has fibrin, that tough, or I'm sorry, keratin, the tough fibrous protein that's going to be present in these cells. So it is water resistant, but not completely waterproof. It does allow some moisture in. The third function is temperature regulation. So what happens when we need to cool off in order to release heat, dermal blood vessels are going to dilate to allow water to be released to sweat glands so that we sweat more. The opposite happens when we are cold. We need to conserve heat. So dermal constriction of dermal blood vessels is going to happen. Other functions of the integumentary system include metabolic regulation, such that there is some waste products. There's also the synthesis of vitamin D. So it's important for everybody to get some sun because that sun actually is responsible for converting the inactive vitamin D into the active vitamin D. It has the integumentary system plays the role of immune defense. Specifically in the epidermis, there are cells called dendritic cells. And the reason this is important is because the epidermis is avascular. There's no blood vessels. So white blood cells would not be able to get to the epidermis. So that's why we need these dendritic cells. Another function is sensory reception, where there are skin receptors that detect things like temperature and touch. For example, a temperature receptor would be called a thermoreceptor. A touch receptor would be called a tactile receptor. And there are some that are found in the epidermis as well as the dermis. And the last function is secretion, primarily sweating, which would be from those merocrine sweat glands that we saw on a previous slide. And then finally, the sebaceous glands, which secrete sebum. So that will help you remember that they are sebaceous glands. Sebum is oil.